In December of last year, the law courts finally gave judgment in the longest and costliest civil action ever heard in London. This is the story of a people called the Banabans.
My lord, the plaintiffs were born on Ocean Island, a very small island just south of the equator. It is 6 miles in circumference and has an area of 1,500 acres.
Nobody ever bothered about this minute place until someone suddenly found it was almost solidly made of phosphate, among the richest deposits in the world. It had 4 villages in which dwelt a very small and peaceable and innocent people. This strange tale begins in 1900 with a bright young New Zealander called Albert Ellis on his way to Ocean Island. Weeks before, he'd found that an old rock propping open his office door was in fact phosphate made of generations of bird droppings, a very valuable fertilizer. It took 2 months to trace the source of this rock to the little pinpoint of Ocean Island. He found a little society living on a sort of Eden, an equatorial island only 3¼ kilometers across. They were great boatmen and fishermen. Indeed, they lived almost entirely on fish and coconuts. Apart from a couple of missionaries, they'd met hardly anyone from anywhere else. They were intuitively kind and gentle, and Ellis was charmed by their welcome. Ellis's tests showed enormous resources of phosphate, so he wasted no time. On the first day, he and his assistant Naylor drew up an agreement signed by a chief. He wrongly took him to be king, but Banabans didn't have kings, who granted him exclusive mining rights for 999 years at £50 a year. Mr. Ellis quickly raised the British flag with, as he put it, its never-failing message of good cheer for the natives. It was good cheer for him, too. Ocean Island turned out to be virtually solid phosphate. Almost at once, the phosphate was being loaded from a makeshift jetty to be shipped to Australia. The simple Banabans joined the game with enthusiasm, loading their own phosphate into Mr. Ellis's ships. Those centuries of seabirds had not laboured in vain. The guano seemed endless. Everywhere else, phosphate had become scarce. Ellis's company had blundered onto a fortune. The only worry was that somebody else might move in on this bonanza. So their influential chairman, Lord Stanmore, persuaded the government to annex Ocean Island to the Empire. What was easier in those halcyon colonial days? So, on September the 28th, 1901, a 21-gun salute was fired and God Save the Queen played to an audience of wholly baffled Banabans. By and by, dozens of illiterate islanders were putting their marks to complicated legal documents they had no earthly means of understanding. By 1908, the company's profits were £500,000 a year. The Banabans continued to be paid an average of £16 an acre. So deep and extensive were the mining shafts that it was clear that the land would soon be useless for any human purpose. Bertram Jones is a journalist on Fiji. He chanced on this Banaban story and dug into the record.
They hadn't realized when they signed that early agreement with the company that the removal of all rock and alluvial phosphate meant removing the entire island except the rock pinnacles. Some of the colonial officers on Ocean Island did, I think, perceive the damage that was being done and tried in ways that were open to them, and they were subject to strict discipline to do something about it.
One of them was a resident commissioner, Quayle Dixon, an impulsive and brave man who felt that the Banaban people were getting a dirty deal and said so.
Quayle Dixon came up against a rather formidable opposition in his efforts to do what he could for the islanders. The opposition, naturally, came from the mining people, who didn't want their rights tampered with in any way, or their rights as they conceived them to be. Quayle Dixon, on the other hand, seemed to be very much concerned about what was happening to the natives, and he resisted what he thought were the undue encroachments and the gentle bending of some of the regulations that the company was indulging in.
Within 10 years of Ellis's arrival, the Banabans had come to hate the phosphate company. They saw the access paths of their lands carelessly mined away, the roots of the coconut trees ruined. Quayle Dixon took these pictures and sent them on to Albert Ellis. Ellis was not amused. Very soon, company pressure saw to it that Quayle Dixon was transferred as far away as possible to the Falkland Islands. The company now wanted another 250 acres. But the Banabans no longer trusted the paternal and avaricious Europeans, who had to offer the elders royalty money and a trust fund to persuade them to sign.
It was also the understanding of their fathers and grandfathers that when once they had conceded those 250 acres, which they were not too pleased about giving, not too happy about it at all, that when once they'd allowed that land to go, they would never be asked for more. But of course, they didn't understand the true nature of that original concession, which they later said, our minds were dark inside when we signed it, we didn't know. And it meant that they hadn't a leg to stand on.
For the Banaban people, life was a matter of survival, and they knew that survival on a dry Pacific island depended entirely on the coconut tree, the tree of life, in fact. The phosphate people so badly needed the land that in the 1913 agreement they put in the clause that finally persuaded the reluctant islanders to sell.
That they shall return all worked out lands to the original owners, and that they shall replant such lands wherever possible with coconuts and other food-bearing trees, both in the lands already worked out and in those to be worked out.
Now, this is a major issue in the great court case. Did the Pacific Phosphate Company ever really intend to replant the coconut trees? And what is whenever possible? This couple of desultory attempts give a pretty cynical reply, with nuts simply dropped on bare rock. The Banabans insist that with a minimum of soil and watering, trees could have grown, and they reckon to know. In 1920, the governments of Britain, Australia and New Zealand bought out the phosphate company for £3.5 million. Now there could be no possible pretense of a disinterested third party in the deal. And soon, yet more land was needed. In 1928, the resident commissioner was the young Arthur Grimble, who later became known for his charming bestseller, A Pattern of Islands. The Banabans were flatly refusing to sell any more land. It was Grimble's job to make them.
To those of you who sold land in 1913 and are willing to sell land again now, they will make up the difference between the royalty they paid then and the 10pence halfpenny a ton.
But by this time, the islanders weren't to be wooed by the bribes and blackmail of the British Phosphate Commissioners, the BPC as they were called. By now they had a spokesman, a young man just back from theological college in the Gilberts.
Will remain unchanged. You will receive no more.
This young man was Rotan Tito, without doubt the most meaningful personality in his people's brief history. Rotan Tito said outright that they wouldn't sell for anything less than £5 a carload. In other words, no deal.
The BPC provides phosphate to the farmers of Great Britain, of Australia, and of New Zealand, to the farmers of the British Empire. And you, your island, is one of the only 2 places in the whole British Empire producing this phosphate. You should be very proud to be...
Rotan said, very well, if the Empire needed the phosphate that much, they could pay £5 a carload for it.
I say to you, Rotan, that you are thinking selfishly, that you are not thinking of your children, of their future. You are stirring up trouble, and it will do you and your people no good if you sell no more land to the BPC. You are signing your own death warrant. Your people will die. You will be committing suicide.
Saturday, 13th August. Most unfortunately, someone voiced dislike of BPC, and in spite of every reason I could adduce to show how entirely dependent they all were on BPC, the popular antipathy to the concern carried the assembly. To overcome their native shame, some extremely strong motive must be instilled into them. The only motive strong enough is fear of poverty. The terms offered are not rich enough to inspire love of gain.
But it wasn't Rotan Tito who was to give Arthur Grimble the most trouble. It was the women.
Friday, 29th July. Women of Buakonikai, about 20. Dreadful objections. It is the mining of the land that brings you the money with which you buy your food. It brings you the doctors who heal you when you are ill. The land lying idle will grow only coconuts. You are no longer used to living only on coconuts. Your food now includes biscuits. It includes rice. Do you realize how foolish, how utterly foolish your attitude is? Talking to them, one had the hopeless certainty that they were not listening, simply sitting and repeating to themselves, "We want to keep our land, we want to keep our land," and so on ad infinitum. Explained before they left that I was not bargaining with them on behalf of the BPC, but was giving them conscientious advice as a friend after long deliberation as to the solid welfare and profit of the Banabans. They did not contradict this, of course, but quite plainly disbelieved in me and the administration and all its works, and the BPC and every other human institution. The interview has left me depressed.
Grimble was fond of the Pacific Islanders in his fashion, but he was also ambitious, and he could bring himself to write this extraordinary letter.
To the people of Buakonikai, greetings. You understand that the resident commissioner cannot again discuss with you at present, as you have shamed his important chief, the chief of the empire. I am not writing to you in my capacity as resident commissioner, but I will put my views as from your long-standing friend, Mr. Grimble, who is truly your father. If everyone signs the agreement, the Banabans will not be punished for shaming the important chief, and their serious misconduct will be forgiven. If the agreement is not signed, consideration will be given to punishing the Banabans. And the destruction of Buakonikai village must also be considered to make room for mining.
Still the islanders refused. Then Whitehall made a law which entitled the British to take land by compulsion. Rotan Tito sent Grimble a bag of gold to pay for a lawyer to help them. Grimble turned him down and signed the compulsory purchase order. In desperation, Rotan wrote to the Secretary of State in London.
Sir, we real Banaban community have the honor to apply respectfully for a personal help from you, because we are in great heaviness of sorrow on account of our land of 150 acres of phosphate to be dug out. It contains a great number of well-grown coconut trees and is the only piece of land which we Banabans live mostly on. So therefore, please kindly help us by your merciful arbitration and judgment in front of our heavenly God and in front of His Majesty King George V. We are your lordship's most pitiable people, the Banaban community. Writer, Rotan Tito, for the native owners.
The letter was ignored. When the mining started in the new area, the local women clung to their trees. If their trees were cut down, let them be cut down too. This was, after all, the most fertile part of the island. Arthur Grimble may have seemed equivocal or even heartless. Maybe he was. But like so many colonial officers who passed through Ocean Island, he was probably basically well-intentioned. Maybe he thought that the greater good of the empire, which was to say the Australian farmers and their fertilizer, meant more than the needs of unimportant island people. Anyway, the women were defeated and their trees destroyed. Then the totally inexplicable happened. Somebody else's war exploded over the Pacific Islands. Death fell out of a blue sky for no reason any Barnaban could understand. On Ocean Island, the phosphate people got out just in time. Not so the Banabans. Under the Japanese occupation, 160 of them were shot. 5 died from flogging. In 1943, the Japanese shipped the rest of them out to labor camps, some to Nauru, some to the dreadful camp at Kusai, where they lived and slept and starved on mud, the rest of them to Tarawa. By the end of the war, 463 Banabans were dead, a third of the whole population. Back came Albert Ellis to reorganize the ruins. He wanted 600 laborers recruited at once, but no Banabans. The reason for this was soon clear. The British residency was a wreck, but the officials were busy making use of the chance that they had long been waiting for to get rid of the Banabans from Ocean Island for good. All the members said the same thing.
It is considered most desirable that this unique opportunity should be taken for taking them to Rambi instead of returning them to Ocean Island. While present shipping difficulties are realized, it is strongly urged that they should not be permitted to frustrate the carrying out of a project which the commissioners have been striving to achieve for decades and which, if not done now, will never be done.
So the remaining Banabans, 1,003 of them, were rounded up on Tarawa and shipped to the island of Rambi in Fiji, 1,600 miles away. They were ill, demoralized, and in no shape to argue.
You should inform them on behalf of the government that their temporary removal to Rambi Island is necessitated by the fact that it is quite impossible for them to return to Ocean Island at the present time.
This was not true. The workers' houses were still there.
Time considered very opportune. Kennedy considers can obtain their willing consent, especially with help Rotan. Imperative no Banabans go to Ocean Island meanwhile.
On December the 15th, 1945, the Banabans first saw Rambi in the rain. It was a daunting change from home. It was 9 times bigger than Ocean Island, 5 times wetter, overgrown with jungle. It had been bought for £25,000 of their own trust fund, their own money. Only now did the British government realize that they were dumping the Banabans on Rambi in the middle of the hurricane season.
Consideration has been given to the disadvantages of canvas housing during the hurricane season. It can be expected that a considerable number of tents will be lost during a strong gale. For this reason, the number of tents has been fixed at about 30% more than would actually be erected in the first instance.
At this point, the Banabans as a people came very near to extinction. They slept on stretchers in tents awash with the relentless rain. They were already weakened by 3 years under the Japanese. The entire community was in real danger of being wiped out. In the first few months, 40 of their older people died. 2 things probably saved them. One was their compulsive and cohesive belief that God was on their side. The other was the presence of Rotan Tito, the man who'd stood up for them, first against Grimble and then against the Japanese. He'd thought that the move to Ramby would be only temporary. The BPC now wanted virtually all that was left of Ocean Island. They offered royalty for the phosphate at 1 3/4 a ton.
Good afternoon, Barnaby.
Later, the lawyers were to ask why the British government, as trustees for the royalty money, approved an offer so far below the going world rate. The Banabans knew nothing about world prices, and they were given no independent advice. But they realized that with this last area of Ocean Island gone, so would be their last hope of returning.
Before I go into details of the royalty payments, I assume that you are happy with this offer, and we...
No. We know that you are going to take all our land, and we need our price to be £250 an acre and 5 shillings per ton royalty.
Ridiculous. How can you possibly justify asking a price like that?
Because you are going to take all our land, and most of us may be intending to go back to Ocean Island. We are here just for temporary, for 2 years, and after that we have to make our mind. We may go back there and no land for us.
It was strange that at these last critical negotiations, the Banaban advisor, the Englishman paid to help them, out of their own funds, did not arrive. Perhaps it was not so strange. The advisor had had a letter from the British High Commission.
You should, of course, take no part whatever in Mr. Maynard's land negotiations with the Banabans, making it clear to them, if necessary.
We have a Banaban advisor here, and he's the man supposed to be here to help us. But I don't know why he didn't turn up.
Perhaps he's ill.
No, he was working in the office all day today. And he didn't come to our meeting today. And when he's supposed to be here, we pay for him as an advisor. And he didn't turn up to help the Banabans at all.
Next year, the BPC came back with a slightly better offer. And the Banabans, again with no legal or technical advice, signed away what was left of their island. Nothing now stood in the way of the mining operation. The labourers were mainly Gilbertese. By 1950, the BPC was exporting 276 million tons of phosphate to be turned into fertiliser. In fairness, it has to be said that this greatly advantaged the farmers of Australia and New Zealand, who were saved about £500,000 a year by getting this subsidised fertiliser. Slowly and clumsily, the Banabans tried to build a new life on Ramby Island, but it wasn't home and never could be. Among people like the Banabans, there's an overwhelming ancestral feeling about land, their own land, their father's land, but no longer their children's land. Their children had never seen Ocean Island, but the bond was born and built into them indestructibly. Over 20 years, they acquired a bus, a hospital, a school, and a petrol pump. And a race of skilled and crafty fishermen had diminished into a race of tin openers, living on Australian canned pilchards. Uprooted and purposeless, the Banabans drift into unemployment and often into drink. Ramby Island has development potential, but the Banabans know nothing about business. They see little future for their children. Nevertheless, they run their island as a true cooperative. Islanders have no entrenched ideas about possessions. The councillors agree on sharing the pooled royalties, which until the 60s were less than £20,000 a year. The undisputed Banaban leader is still Rotan Tito, chairman of the council. His son, Tabuki Rotan, is heir apparent and manager. His grandson, Thomas Tay is secretary.
We've got our problems here on Rambi. It revolves around the young people. On Ocean Island, I heard that these things weren't there. These problems were non-existent. But now that we are in Fiji, the community is loose. Rambi is a lot bigger than Ocean Island. Villages are not organized as they used to be on Ocean Island. And because of this, children are left loosely, so to speak. And, you know, having nothing to do, they involve themselves in all sorts of mischiefs. And this is building up on Rambi right now. They'll get drunk, and they'll be disorderly, they'll destroy things, they'll burn houses. These are the major problems that we're facing with the young people.
Some say, naturally, that if the Banabans got rich, it would go to their heads. Rotan Tito makes that story look silly. He's the biggest landowner, but he shares all his money, like everybody else. That's the islanders' tradition. Thus, no one has a car or a posh house. To show off what you own is just not done. Rotan spends much of his time reading his Bible. He lives among his big, extended family, who, like all Banabans, sleep on mats and keep their possessions in suitcases. The diet is poor and dull and repetitive. No one could say that the Ocean Island phosphate brought much luxury to the Banabans. It wasn't until 1960 that Rotan Tito chanced to read in a magazine that all along the British government had been supporting the Gilbert and Ellice Islands, who had no phosphate, out of their money, the phosphate money, paying the Gilbertese 11 times what they paid the Banabans. Finally, in 1966, Rotan's son Tibuki decided to look for help in the outside world.
It is nonsense that we don't need the money. We need a lot of money to build up this island. When we came here, we haven't got any good homes, no good roads, no proper buildings for our schools and hospitals. In fact, it is our money. It's not the money of somebody else. It is wrong for the British government to tell us what to do with our money. I don't think any Englishman would accept this, or anyone in the world. I believe that they are using their power for the fact that we are small and tell us, dictating us how to use our own money. And they should shame of themselves.
Tibuki set out from Rambi with literally no idea of where to go or whom to see, no plans, only this sense of deep injustice. First, he went to see fellow Methodists in Fiji and some local lawyers. He went to Australia and New Zealand to try and talk to their governments. But he soon realized that this was not where the real power lay, so he decided to go to London. His father had always said, in Britain, you always get justice.
I did not know how to make arrangement for accommodation. I just got on the plane and came. I thought that it was easy, like in Suva, just to step in and ask a room. So when I got in the airport, I got in a taxi and I asked him to take me to London. And when he asked me what part of London, I did not know. So we spent the time moving around somewhere, you know. And he had enough of all that, so he said, well, I better get you off. I can't do all this. You don't know where the hotel is and so on. It cost me 12 pounds. And so I got out with all my two suitcases, and I did not know where to go. I walked around, looking there. I went inside. It's the wrong place. Fortunately, I met an Indian at 3 a.m. in the morning, and he thought I look like an Indian, you see. So I said, no, I'm a Banaban from Fiji, but I got lost.
At last he found a bed in a Methodist hostel. He then bought himself a raincoat, and then he made the first of many, many trips to the Foreign and Commonwealth Office. In the last 10 years, Tibuki has called on that office 50 times. Uphill work indeed. He reminded the bureaucrats that the Banabans had been loyal. He reminded them of the time when 500 of them had raised an astonishing £12,000 for Britain's war effort. He asked for a realistic sum to set them on their feet in Rambi. It was reckoned that Britain owed them many millions in royalties. In 1967, he got an offer from Judith Hart of £80,000, for which the Banabans would have to withdraw all claims to the start of the century.
I have faith in these high officials, and I believe that they must have a courage to do what they believe is right, because all we ask is not to grab someone's money or someone's homeland. It's our own homeland. It's our own money. We are not trying to grab the money of the people of England or the Gilbertese. It's all ours by right. And we've been explaining this to them year by year, papers after papers. See? But it is sad. I mean, being a minister myself, and also educated among the white people, it is sad for me to see people in high places not having that courage, to do what is right.
Tabuki told his tale to 7 ministers of state. They were all very charming. They told him how pleased they were to have heard his story, and they did nothing at all.
It's very, very difficult to understand how your top man works, how to convince them, how to help them to see the truth. It's very, very hard. I've been reading all these papers, listening, watching television, political programs and so forth. Still, I don't know how to convince your people.
By 1969, Tabuki had found a flat in Victoria. He had the patience of Joe, but he sadly decided they'd just have to take these people to court, and that meant a lawyer. And how to find one? How he did find one is a kind of fantasy. One day he saw a tramp in Victoria Station. He tried to give him some money, a Barnaban custom, but he'd no time. Later that evening, a young Irish porter from his block of flats asked him out for a drink. They finished up in a Fleet Street pub, and there, lo and behold, was that same miserable tramp from Victoria Station sitting nearby.
I was so surprised to see the man again, the same man I saw in Victoria Street, sitting on his own, with all these rags, you almost see through all the holes. So I offer him coffee and sandwiches and cigarettes, and I tried to find out whether he was really the man I saw in Victoria at 2 p.m. It was then almost 3 a.m. in the morning, and he said he was. And then he told me that his plan was to commit suicide at 3 o'clock by jumping into the river, because he had given up life. He was so poor. So I persuaded him not to commit suicide, but to start, I would try to help him to start a new life. He didn't believe it in the first place. And I said, no, let us go back to my flat. And we worked out how much it would cost me to give him everything, to stock, keys, everything, I have to change him, give him everything.
The fairy tale goes on. The redeemed tramp returns to ask Tabuki how can he possibly repay him. Tabuki says, just tell me who's the best lawyer in England. And the answer comes, why, Richard Brown of Wimbledon. Now, Mr. Richard Brown of Wimbledon had at the time a staff of 1 plus his wife. But to Tabuki from Ocean Island, Mr. Brown of Wimbledon was part of the divine plan and not to be questioned.
Can I see Mr. Brown, please?
Oh, yes, certainly. We have an appointment.
And so it came to pass that probably the most complex and heavily documented case in British legal history landed in the lap of the understandably nervous Mr. Brown of Wimbledon. But Mr. Brown did the Banabans proud in his choice of counsel. The eminent QC Elwyn Jones agreed to take the brief, although he had to give it up when he became Lord Chancellor, with, as junior, John MacDonald, highly thought of at the Chancery Bar. By and by, learned counsel, including Mr. Brown of Wimbledon, found themselves on Ramby among dancing girls and a band playing "O God, Our Help in Ages Past." Elwyn Jones made a stirring speech about David and Goliath, which went down very well. John MacDonald came back later to sieve through the jungle of evidence to find a case that might stand up in court, encouraged by the island band playing Victorian hymns.
Did she agree or ever sign anything saying that the land could be mined?
No.
So just to recap, Betterow, who owned these bits of land in 1913, refused to let them be included in the eastern mining area, and so everything else was mined and these islands were left. Then in 1947, without asking her, they just mined it and it's disappeared.
Yes, that's good.
And have you ever been paid anything for it?
Oh, yes. Up here, no, nothing at all.
And was your mother ever paid anything for it?
Again, as far as you remember, nothing ever received.
Then I think we shall probably want you to come to London to give evidence in the case. Would you be prepared to do that? It won't be too bad because Tabuki, I expect, will go and Rotan will be going and perhaps one or two others.
I don't know how to explain it. But I have explained it to Lord Elwin. When he was Elwin in the first place, I said you would be surprised how I happen to know you and to engage you with this big undertaking. It's all through the poor man, you know, with the help of the porter, an Irish young boy.
Early last year, a boatload of Banabans set off again for Ocean Island. For years they'd been asking for independence. Now they felt they'd be in a stronger position with some of them actually on the island. But the British countered this by declaring Ocean Island a closed district, and that no Banaban who hadn't been actually born there could enter without a license. A few with special permits to set foot on their native land arrived at a place they could hardly recognize, as a few more tons of it vanished into a phosphate cargo ship. It's now established that half the workers' children on Ocean Island have chest diseases because of this fine white phosphate dust which blows continually over their homes. All the water now has to be imported. This was always a problem on the island. Today, everyone tells the Banabans they're crazy to think they could live here when the British commissioners clear out.
We lived here before the BBC. We had no problems. And you know, if it goes out, we'll just revert to our old system. And as far as water is concerned, which is the main problem here, our people thrived on Ocean Island before the BBC started bringing water from overseas. And if there is really a scarcity of water on the island, we've got Rambi in Fiji, you know, where water abounds. This is our advantage. And I think all these ideas of difficulties and all this, these are all English. You put a native on Ocean Island, he'll survive.
The Banabans, whose home it is, look like squatters and feel like refugees. The phosphate people make it clear that they're an unwelcome embarrassment. Rotan Tito went to the camp to try and lift the morale and reduce the resentment. Not easy. Never have his people felt more like second-class citizens than here, where they belong. On his second day on Ocean Island, Rotan Tito went to look at what had been Bukonikai village, where he'd been born, where his mother's family had lived for generations. It was also, unfortunately, the richest in phosphate. They are now mining it for the second time.
Yon ni mabui tios. Dengan ai roge. Yon ni mabui kia. Ora au chemena di no kai. Now still. Ai ai.
The experts reckon there are about 3 years of phosphate mining left, maybe £60 million worth. Then, says the BPC manager, we'll leave the island to the birds. Not all the British phosphate people are wholly insensitive to what they've done.
I think most people imagine Ocean Island to be just a solid rock with very little vegetation, but in effect in the 40s and 50s this area here was very well covered with palm trees, mangoes, pandanus, well, most of the tropical fruits. There was a massive vegetation right through, particularly this area where the machines are working now. Sad, of course, always to see destruction of trees, I think. Then there's many, many other places where trees are destroyed, sometimes unnecessarily in land development and so on. And in this case, of course, there's a great benefit to Australia and New Zealand.
The Banabans understand, but not altogether. Could it not have been done without totally destroying their island? Did the phosphate people have to humiliate them so, embitter them so? The wound has gone very deep.
I think the BPC are the greatest exploiters of Banaban people. And, you know, I hold no reservation on that one. We've been ill-treated by them in 1900. Maybe we could understand that because we were uneducated then. And I'm not saying that, you know, we're fully educated now, but even at this age and time, they're still, you know, treating us as if we are fools. I just can't understand that, you know, people can do such a thing to another human being. It's just sheer exploitation.
By 1975, a terrific rise in world phosphate prices gave the Banabans enough royalties to allow Rotan Tito to come to London to bring 2 legal cases, one against the British Phosphate Commissioners and one against the British government. For this dedicated old man, now 76, it was a strain. He was often ill.
This girl, ladies and gentlemen of the jury, coming home late at night, all alone.
When Rotan wasn't in court, he spent his time in the Victoria flat watching television films he couldn't understand and would probably have hated if he could. His Sunday book he learned to cook, sort of, and became expert in Chinese takeaways.
Ravished. Yes, ravished at gunpoint by this half-crazed and fully nude, sadistic, perverted,
Every day, the Banaban witnesses went to the law courts in their identical new raincoats. Their first case claimed £6 million compensation for the 250 acres of their island which should have been replanted with coconuts whenever possible. Rotan Tito soon discovered that British justice was not as clear-cut and simple as he'd thought. He was troubled and hurt that under cross-examination it seemed as though he were on trial.
Do not try to make us fools. I would only beg of my lord that I am the plaintiff. I have been knocking and begging that I may come before the government of Britain to show what I have deeply felt, so that our complaints be heard in the High Court to arrive at the truth. It was expected when I arrived at the court that I would be asking the questions to the court, because I was the one who has been robbed.
It seemed to Rotan that nobody would ever understand what had happened to Ocean Island until they'd seen it.
My lord, it is the plaintiff's view that it will be of great assistance to your lordship to view Ocean Island personally. While we are aware that the journey of over 11,000 miles will be a long and tiring one, we also feel that it will be of great value to your lordship to see the evidence with your own eyes.
The defense objected strongly, but the judge agreed to go, doubtless setting all manner of awkward precedents for future judges.
One matter, I think, should be left wholly out of account, and that is inconvenience to the judge. A view of Ocean Island would, of course, be far removed from being a pleasant holiday trip to the South Seas. The journey would be long and exhausting, and a proper inspection of the rugged terrain of the island would, in all probability, involve a considerable degree of strenuous agility in high temperature. Nevertheless, this seems to me, though by no great margin, to fall within the bounds of what a litigant is reasonably entitled to expect from a judge.
His lordship almost certainly didn't expect that the sea would be so rough that he would arrive on Ocean Island in a crate with its green Bermudas very wet. The whole trip, including a visit to Ramby, cost £40,000. There were 9 people in the judge's party, all speculating on what his lordship was speculating.
Yeah.
The party included Dick Turpin, lands officer for the Gilbert and Ellice Islands, Roy Price, solicitor to Her Majesty's government or the Crown, George Clark, solicitor to the British Phosphate Commissioners, John Vinelot, QC, counsel to the Crown, and Donald Ratty, counsel to the phosphate people. The counsel for the Banabans was John MacDonald, and their solicitor, Keith Hollis, from Mr. Richard Brown of Wimbledon. Arthur Bradford, the judge's clerk, came along to look after his lordship. The gentlemen were not ill paid, the barristers getting an average of £150 a day plus expenses. Is it a lump of phosphate, or is it perhaps not a lump of phosphate?
The phosphoric acid will replace most of the powder. Now you get a calcium phosphate instead of a calcium powder.
Perhaps his lordship was not all that much the wiser. But then it was necessary to consider the complex problem of how far a coconut root has to go to find water, a question rarely arising in the law courts. The Banabans claimed £6 million for the failure to replant the land. How did the judge rate the chances of the coconut tree? And now to the golf course, where the Banaban lawyers show the judge how the island once looked. The one and only Banaban knows his place, 6 steps to the rear. The few Europeans are steeling themselves to excavate the golf course, which, with the ruined residency, is all that's left.
Built in 1938, like Bali, destroyed by the Japanese in 1938.
The outing had a certain strain, with the lawyers quietly competing to drop in the discreet word at the right time. Judge McGarry listened and remained judicially inscrutable.
You actually rake the green every time you played onto it,
It was terribly hot, but the judge kept up the pace, and it was a weary lot of lawyers who got back to London to finish off a case that beat all records by lasting 105 days. The second case, however, most troubled the government, because this questioned the whole integrity of the colonial record.
Rotan Tito and the Council of Leaders against Her Majesty's Attorney General. My lord, this is a case of breach of trust by the British government against the people of Ocean Island.
It all began with our colonization of the Gilbert and Ellice Islands, which needed a lot of money for roads and schools and hospitals and, of course, administration. They didn't have any phosphate resources, but Ocean Island did. So, obviously, embody Ocean Island into the protectorate. But the Banabans have no relationship, no cultural or emotional bonds with the Gilbert and Ellice people. Why, they asked, Should the British, without even telling them, spend 85% of their money, the phosphate money, on people who didn't own an inch of Ocean Island? Their argument was, if Britain was going to colonize people, she should at least pay for them herself. This phosphate business had therefore caused a quite unnecessary hostility between these little Pacific societies. The Gilbertese chief minister, Naboa Razieta, says his people need the money as much as the Banabans.
I think the Banabans do not have the right sense of possession, or they misunderstand it. Because, you know, if we struck oil, say, inside this lagoon, and who's going to benefit out of it? Or who's going to dictate how it is being divided between the people of the Gilbert and Ellice Islands? Are they the people of Taro? I don't think so.
But it wasn't the people of Tarawa who were dispossessed and exiled. The second Barnaban case claimed that the British government, as their trustee, had a duty in 1931 and 1947 to pay them the proper commercial rates, which would have made them better off by £21 million. They were now convinced that they had been, and are being, deliberately misled, and the Colonial Office minutes prove it.
It seems to me that a point for consideration is whether we should warn the Fiji government that we are quite definitely going to the talks in January, ready, in effect, to ditch the Banabans if this proves necessary.
All sorts of documents like this turned up in the court case while Ocean Island continued to disappear. Now Tabuki finally realized that Grimble and the phosphate negotiators were, in fact, getting their orders from the British government.
I never believed that in my whole life. All along, I believed my father when he often said, no, we better go to England, you know, to see the top people, Secretary of State. He's just a good man, you know, kind man, you know. You won't do all these things. Only these small people down below, you know, they've been treating us in this manner. Well, for the first time, I learned. It was the instruction from the very top man, you see. And, you know, you saw me how I felt. You know, I looked back and said, what a wasting time and wasting of money to come all the way from Fiji, trusting that the top man is a good man.
On the 18th of June, the two cases finally ended. After 221 days, 7 million spoken words, and costs of £750,000. So the lawyers left Court 16 for the last time. John MacDonald, the Barnaban counsel, had had a long haul. As the judge said, his professional and private life had been engulfed by the affairs of Ocean Island. Judge McGarry went away to spend 4 months writing his immense and massive judgment. He knew well the vast precedents it would establish, and this is what he decided. In the first case, he found that the phosphate people had failed to keep their promise to replant the Banabans' land. The Banabans should get damages, but just how much he could not bring himself to say. This they must go away to settle with the British Phosphate Commissioners. For the failure to restore the ravaged land, he said,
"The damages shall not be token, not minimal, but not large."
He discounted the argument that nowadays mined land must legally be restored.
However potent such arguments may be in political or social fields, they cannot affect the law of contract.
The second case, on the breach of trust issue, was finely balanced and could clearly have gone either way. Judge McGarry eventually decided that the British government were not, in fact, trustees to the Banabans. The British were therefore not technically liable for the injustices committed in their name and in the cause of immense millions of pounds of profit from phosphate. Nevertheless, he added, in words rarely used by judges against governments, and which this government cannot possibly ignore, the government owed a moral duty to the Banabans and had let them down many times. He specified 2 glaring examples which occurred during the 2 negotiations when the Banabans had to make their most critical decisions. First, by letting Arthur Grimble personally fix the meagre royalty, having compromised himself with a disgracefully threatening letter about destroying the village, and unspecified punishments if they didn't agree to sell their land. Grimble may have been ill and run down at the time, he said.
Even so, with every allowance, it is impossible to read that letter without a sense of outrage.
And the judge went on to say,
the other failure of government was the gravest in its consequences to the Banabans. That was the absence of any advice when they were embarking on the 1947 negotiations. The improvidence of the disposition must have been foreseeable by persons of business experience.
The judge concluded with a most unusual recommendation.
I am powerless to give the plaintiff any relief, but in litigation against the Crown, I think a judge must direct attention to a wrong that he cannot right, and leave it to the Crown to do what it considers proper. The Crown is traditionally the fountain of justice, and justice is not confined to what is enforceable in the courts.
But where else but the courts was it left for the Banabans to go for justice? How will they explain to their children the meaning of words like these?
The question is not whether the Banabans should succeed as a matter of fairness or ethics or morality. I have no jurisdiction to make an award just because I conclude they have had a raw deal.
So it is back to square one, or square nothing, for the people of Ocean Island. It took the courts 105 days to come to no conclusion about the amount of the replanting damages, 116 days to decide that in the breach of trust issue they didn't have a case at all. There would be no £20 million compensation, just more and more incomprehensible legal words. Perhaps out of those words may come an urge of conscience that a British government may even yet give the islanders the justice they denied them for nearly 80 years.